Hi, everyone. My name is James Kenley. I have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Vail Symposium. On behalf of our board chair, Dale Mosier, and our entire board, welcome, and thank you for spending your evening with us. We are a nonprofit organization, and ticket sales account for about 10% of our operating revenue. So donors at every level make a real impact in our ability to deliver our programming. I'd like to thank a few organizations and individuals who helped make tonight possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. The summer season is generously underwritten by Cindy Engels, and we offer special thanks to the Inn at Riverwalk for their support this evening. Clay is a dear friend of the Vail Symposium and a renowned humanities scholar and historian. We love when he's here in town. Couple things you may not know. I would encourage you to check out his podcast called Listening to America, and you can follow his writings at governing.com. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Clay Jenkinson.
Hey ho, thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to see you. You know, it's one of the most beautiful nights in the year 2023, and the fact that you came here is a monument to the Vail Symposium, and I so appreciate seeing you. It is true that I've begun this new initiative called Listening to America, and so you see, so I've started this new initiative called Listening to America. And the last time I was here, I begged for an Airstream, and none of you would give me one, which I think is wrong and unfair. But I now have one. I don't have it yet, but it's coming. And I'm beginning this fall, and then for the next number of years, I'm going to wander around this great country in search of America. And you know, the 250th birthday of the country is coming. How are we doing? Who? Tech. And that's not my Airstream, but that's an Airstream. And you can go to my website, ltamerica.org. We already went on our first great journey, Water in the West, down to the Four Corners. And I was on Lake Powell and at Great Salt Lake and the North Rim and the Vermilion Mountains and so on and so forth. And we went out on the lake, and it was 178 feet down, nearly at what's called dead pool. And then the big winter. You've seen the Colorado River, right? So if you can imagine it, this is a 200-mile lake. It's up already 55 feet, heading towards maybe 80 feet. Just imagine the amount of water that is coming off the Sierra and other places. It won't refill. It would take 5 years like this to refill, and that's unlikely to happen. But just imagine that. And so that you can go follow that. That's a 12 installment thing. I've just finishing one now. I'm heading tomorrow up to the North Unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, and so on. So now that I have the Airstream, or will have, now's the time for you to pony up with the several $100,000 that this is going to take. So just so whenever you're ready on that one. So let me move on. So I'm going to talk about Native Americans. I'm obviously an Anglo. I understand the vulnerability of that. And I think about it all the time. On the other hand, I've spent much of my life reading about, thinking about traveling in Native American country, working with Native Americans in a range of ways. And so I feel that it's important to talk about these things, and I particularly feel it's important for us non-natives to get up to speed on what really is the situation, or some of the situation, in Indian country, as it's called. So I'm going to use the word Native American mostly. Different people want different terms for this. American Indian is fine, or Mandan, or Arapaho, or Shoshone. But the term that's usually now regarded as the best term to use is Native American. But when you talk about Indian country or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we revert to that term. So I'll come back to that. Here's Deb Haaland, and I want to say there's such good news in Indian country. Deb Haaland is the first Native American Secretary of the Interior in the United States. Think of that. And think of what that means. Not only for the lens that she wears, You probably know that many of our national parks and national forests and national monuments were carved out of sovereign native land, almost always without consultation. So she wears a lens in looking at the world through native eyes, not just through native eyes, but also she now, look at the beauty of this person. She's now an exemplar that's going to inspire thousands and thousands and thousands of people, especially young native women, to believe you can really do anything in this country. And so I think that's just spectacular. And just a couple of quick slides just to show you. I mean, look at this. Some parts of the Native American world are resurgent and thriving and dynamic, and just look at the pride in this young woman. And how about this? The mother or the aunt getting the young dancer ready for the big dance. So just quickly to establish a little bit of a credential, I've worked extensively with the Commissioner of Native Affairs in North Dakota, that's Scott Davies. Kevin Locke, some of you will have heard of, he was the nation's leading native flute player, and he was a hoop dancer. How many of you have ever seen a hoop dance? He would get 28 hoops going, and there'd be eagle and clouds and beavers, and it's amazing. Unfortunately, he recently passed away, but this is the great Lakota Kevin Locke. So a couple just quick statistics. There are 566 federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States, but that's only about 85% of the tribes. And so not all native tribes are federally recognized, and this is a real crisis for those that are not. And then just quickly, poverty. Poverty rate for American Indians living on reservations is 29.4%, double that of the national average in the United States. And the reservation poverty rate is 36% compared to 9% for the nation at large. So Native American poverty, unemployment, despair continue to be very significant issues. But some things, these are topics I want to get to if we have time. Number one, we're still here. You know, I'm going to talk about Edward S. Curtis here after a while, and Curtis believed that Native Americans were going to disappear. So did Theodore Roosevelt. So did almost everybody. Almost everybody around the time of 1905 or so believed that Native Americans would either disappear culturally and be amalgamated the way Irish Americans are and Polish Americans are and Italian Americans are, or they would disappear altogether. And so he, Curtis, and others were seeking what they called the vanishing Indian. The fact is, Native peoples did not vanish. There's a rebound. At the time of Curtis, there were perhaps 225,000 Native people in this country. Now it's over 5 million. And so there has been a marvelous resurgence of Native people in the period since. Secondly, we'll come back to what terminology we should use in Native American and so on. I want to talk about reservation homelands, the question of sovereignty, which is going to rock the 21st century, water, already a very significant issue in Indian country and only going to become more so. What is cultural appropriation, cultural genocide and assimilation? So we may not get to all of that, but I hope we get to much of it. This is what many, I'll just speak from my own state, North Dakota. North Dakota is a red state, as you perhaps know, 760,000 people. I would think that in North Dakota, 480,000 people are red. Really red. Really, really, really red. And this is the kind of language I hear, but you would hear it maybe here, but certainly in Rifle, Cortez, Lyman. Why can't they just get over it? I mean, think of this. I hear this all the time. Why won't they just get on board and enjoy the American dream? Why do we need Indian reservations? Why don't they pick themselves up by their bootstraps? Aren't they all on welfare? Aren't the casinos bad for real progress? My ancestors weren't even here when all this happened. Believe me, I hear this litany all the time, and we have to challenge ourselves when we get into that mode. All right, so let's talk about names for a moment. When Columbus came and the first Spaniards, they spoke of the indigenous people as Los Indios, a fundamental mistake that has bedeviled American history ever since. Because, of course, they weren't Los Indios, they were Americanos. And even the word America comes from Amerigo Vespucci, who was an Italian explorer who pretended that he came here and never did. Think of that, we're named after a fraud. Well, maybe that makes perfect sense, I don't know. And so then from Los Indios we got Indians, as a kind of a big generic term, which really continued until the 1960s, I would say, when American Indians became a more appropriate, more sensitive, more generous term than Native Americans, more recently Indigenous Americans or First Peoples. I've worked with countless Native peoples, and they are not nearly as concerned about this as we are. My friend Scott Davis, for example, says, "Hey, I'm an Indian, just get over it, let's not get stuck there." But other natives prefer to be spoken of in more, let's call it enlightened terms. And then look at this, so the people we call the Sioux do not call themselves the Sioux, or didn't. Sioux is a term of abuse heaped upon the Dakota by the Ojibwe. Their enemies, the Ojibwe, called them the Nada Sioux, which means those awful snaky people. And so how would you like to be known as the awful snaky people, a name given to you by your enemy? And so the Sioux are graduating out of Sioux, and now they prefer to be called Dakota or Lakota or Unkpapa or Minikanju. The Nez Perce of Idaho never pierced their ears, and yet they're called Nez Perce. It's actually from Native Sign Language, and one theory of this is the Native sign for the Nez Perce people was this, like salmon fishing, and a Frenchman thought, oh, they pierce their noses, do they? Truly, you can't make this up. And so they prefer to be called the Nimipu. The Flatheads didn't flatten their heads. They prefer to be called the Salish. The Crow, in my neighboring Montana, prefer to call themselves the Absaroka. Crow is a kind of a cousin term, a white term, meaning that Absaroka means something like raven. And so white people said crow. The Blackfeet prefer to be called the Pikuni or the Pigan. The Chippewa call themselves the Anishinaabe. The Arapaho, I'm not even going to try that. And the Arikara, the Sanish. So now we're slowly moving towards these more sensitive terms, and it's hard, believe me, because you all agree, I think, we're so used to those other terms that we sort of inadvertently fall back in them. And so maps are changing. In fact, I just got a map in grasslands, in the national grasslands of South Dakota, and had a new sticker label on it saying many of the terms in this map are no longer acceptable. In the next printing, we'll catch up. This is happening all over. All right, so here are some names we might wish to adjust. Places named Custer, Harney, I'll come back to that, Nelson Miles, Miles City, Montana, George Crook, Camp Crook, Crook County, Kit Carson, Philip Sheridan, William Tecumseh Sherman, that should say Sherman after Tecumseh, and Andrew Jackson. What do they all have in common? They were white Indian fighters. And so places are named all over the country after them, and you can imagine that Native people find that a little irking. Because why would you, if you are a Lakota and the place is named Custer State Park, and it's in your ancestral homelands, you might wish that a more sensitive word were replaced. So of course, even here in Colorado, you know that the word squaw is one of the vilest words. It's an Algonquin word. I won't give you the translation, but it is a vile term about a woman's anatomy. She's my squaw. So that's gone almost everywhere now. And of course, here's Mount Evans. You've been following this, I feel certain. There's a magnificent new exhibit at the Colorado History Center in Denver on the Sand Creek Massacre. Has any of you seen it? You must. It is fabulous because it's told by the Cheyenne and the Arapaho about the famous massacre in November of 1864. It's first rate. So guess who made that happen? This is one of their panels. Evans was convinced by misinformation, et cetera, He inspired racist attacks on the Arapaho and the Cheyenne in the newspapers. He gave permission to soldiers to go kill men, women, and children. He wanted to get rid of natives in the state of Colorado once and for all. And he paid no price for it. And I'll just read what they say. Evans could have publicly admitted that he was wrong in thinking the Cheyenne and Arapaho would attack Denver, but he was too concerned with political image. He continued to dehumanize Cheyenne and Arapaho people by deliberately allowing the Hungate family's bodies, that's one of the incidents, to be used to incite genocidal frenzy and so on. And so he survived that politically, but today there is a very strong feeling that Mount Evans should probably no longer be called Mount Evans, because this was a man who actually, we talk about genocide and we need to be very careful about throwing that term around, but he actually proposed a complete ethnic erasure of native peoples in what's now the state of Colorado. So that sign's going. This is Harney Peak in the Black Hills. Anyone climbed it? Great climb. Harney was one of those Indian fighters, and not a very nice one either. So now that this is what it was called, Harney Peak, 1896 to 2016, now called Black Elk Peak, after the Lakota prophet and seer Black Elk. But guess what? Even that creates chaos. Because guess who did this? It was the Federal Geologic Survey that changed the name from Harney to Black Elk. But then it turns out that the Lakota, he was an Ogallala, Lakota, the Lakota don't name places after individuals in their tribe. And so when this happened, I think some of this is happening here too, right? But when this happened, the Lakota said, hey, you might have wanted to consult us about this. It's nice that you wanted Black Elk to be remembered, but we don't do that. We don't honor a single person, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Rain in the Face, by naming places after them. So you can see how dense and difficult all of this is, and good luck with your own. Here's this beautiful peak. It's the highest point between the Rocky Mountains and the East Coast. It's worth going to. What? Well, of course, yes, all the way over. And here it is, at the end of the great, great, great book, Black Elk Speaks, which was formulated by John Neihart after extensive interviews with Black Elk. Black Elk had his vision when he was about 11 years old. He's Ogallala. He had a fever and nearly died, and he was in this sort of prone in a lodge for several weeks, and everyone assumed he would die. He had a vision, and he was carried out of his body and taken to the top of Black Elk Peak, where he had this incredibly beautiful vision of the Red Road and the Great Circle and Harmony and so on. Then, of course, the mayhem of the second half of the 19th century occurred. When he was old, really old, Neihart went back and asked, they had become very close friends. He said to Black Elk, is there anything I can do for you? And Black Elk said, yes, I'd like to be taken to the top of Harney Peak one more time before I die. So Neihart took his jalopy, and they took Black Elk there. And Black Elk could no longer paint his body red. He was supposed to paint his body with red pigment, so he put on red long johns. And he went up there and he prayed at the top of Harney Peak. So this great book, which I so deeply recommend, ends with this. It ends with Wounded Knee, the massacre that occurred on December 29th, 1890 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And this paragraph, white people came in, they misunderstood the ghost dance. The soldiers panicked. They killed 200 native people, men, women, and children in a massacre that simply didn't need to happen. And this is what Black Elk, he was there. He was a young man in his early 20s, and this is what he said. I did not know then how much was ended. When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked gulch, as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. I mean, that's just magnificent and so perfectly uttered. And that would not have happened if John Neihart, a white historian, had not encountered Black Elk and asked if he could help to tell his story. So you get a sense on names. That's just to touch the tip of it. How about cultural appropriation? I think you all, because this is Vail, a well-educated, highly sophisticated, cosmopolitan people, truly, you know about cultural appropriation. So I'm just going to quickly go through. That's cultural appropriation. That is cultural appropriation, and it's deeply offensive to Native people. And these are cultural appropriations. You know, the Redskins have changed their name finally, but the Atlanta Braves and the Cleveland Indians, and when you can't make this up. When I was growing up in Jenkinson, North Dakota, we had a small teachers college, and the team name was the Jenkinson State College Savages. And there are still team names of this sort in the far west. So in 1972, Jenkinson State, after, the name changes are agonizing and they create bitterness for decades, they finally changed their name to Blue Hawks, which is a prairie bird, a hawk. And even to this day, you'll see people at homecoming wearing, "I will always be a savage." And I think that's right. They always will be. And the Blackhawks and so on. And then, at the game, the Braves, all that stuff. So this is sort of an answer to that. But I'm honoring you, dude. Here's another. This was UND in North Dakota. They're fighting Sioux. The Sioux are the Dakota, as we went through. And they don't like to be known as fighting, particularly. So it took 22 years to change that. And there is still bitterness all over the state. Or how about this? I love this one. This is, Columbus or the Spaniards coming. What if they infect us with diseases, slaughter us, lock us on reservations, and name their sports teams the Redskins? Oh, come on, they would never call a team the Redskins. And this. Now this one may upset some of you, but the dream catcher, some of you have dream catchers. The dream catcher is sort of a pan-Indian thing. It has origins in native country, but it sort of spread like wildfire and jumped out of the Indian world, the native world, into the much broader world. And this is a low-level piece of cultural appropriation. The idea of cultural appropriation is that I'm an Anglo. I don't have the right to wear headdresses, to smoke a peace pipe, to do certain things because I haven't earned that right, and I'm taking from another culture something that I want for myself without any exchange, without any true transaction. And so some of this can go a little too far, of course, but it's important that we understand why indigenous people feel this way, and it's important that we try to be sensitive to those things. All right, so water is life. Look at these two. I was just on the Navajo on the Diné reservation not so long ago, where water is a terrible, terrible problem. Most people except in reservation towns, do not have running water. 58 out of every 1,000 native households don't have access to indoor plumbing. 49% of tribal homes do not have access to reliable water sources, clean drinking water, or basic sanitation. You probably remember the DAPL pipeline controversy from up in North Dakota. I was there. I went down there a number of times. More than 10,000 people from all over the world came to show solidarity with the Dakota. This is why. Here's the pipeline. And if you can imagine it, let me see if I can get the laser pointer to work. If you can imagine it, the pipeline, here's Bismarck. The pipeline was going to cross just north on the Missouri River, cross just north of Bismarck. Population 90,000, predominantly white. The people of Bismarck said, no, we don't want that pipeline because what if it burst and it would befoul our water? So they put it here, precisely 1 mile north of the boundary of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. And when the natives said, hey, we don't really want that, what if it bursts? The government of North Dakota and the pipeline companies and so on said, oh, come on, they're always safe. And so this led to this international controversy. It's not over yet. And the Dakota say that several of their sacred sites were affected by this, and certainly would be by a spill. And although this, how do I talk about this? I don't want to spend much time on it, but this thing had two impacts. It didn't change the pipeline, it was put exactly there. But it was a great moment for Native people because they came from all over the country. The 7 different fires of the Lakota met for the first time in more than 100 years. People who went down there saw young Native people bareback on horseback galloping across the plains. It was sort of a kind of a political Woodstock for Native peoples, where there was just an enormous joy and pride, a kind of resurgence. We're here. We're going to make our voices known. But for white Indian relations in North Dakota, it was a setback. Most of the white people of North Dakota came away soured by this, and it divided the two cultures farther apart. Here again. And this is how water is delivered through literally hundreds of thousands of Native peoples across the West, particularly the Southwest. And here again, this woman is carrying water and other things back to her home. So water, no time to go into it, but there's something known as the Winters Doctrine, Supreme Court in the Winters case, which means that Native people, so in this case the Ute, the Arapaho, out on the plains the Dakota or the Cheyenne, under the Winters Doctrine, those peoples have inherent sovereign rights to the amount of water that flows through their land that they can adequately use. So that's a general grant, and hasn't been much invoked until recently, and now it is. And if you've been following the issues on the Colorado River, the tribes adjacent to the river are asserting their Winters Doctrine rights, and the U.S. court systems are largely siding with them. And of course, on the Supreme Court, it's Neil Gorsuch, who has some roots here, who has turned out to be a champion of Native American rights. He just weighed in very powerfully on the Indian child welfare decision that was made last week. So water is going to be one of the issues of the 21st century. And here's what's happening. You know, when I was growing up in North Dakota, we have many reservations, Natives were very quiescent and living in such poverty that they didn't have a lot of options. But now they've been sending their young people to get MBAs, to become nurses, to become doctors, to become lawyers, and they are coming back to the reservation world with all of these skills, and they're asserting them, and our court systems are largely siding with them. And so we are in for a very, very, very interesting 21st century. Will be quite different, and these solutions will not be bloody battles of the sort you saw at Sand Creek or Wounded Knee. These will be legal battles, and increasingly the Natives all over the country are winning those battles. All right, so let me talk about, you probably have never really even heard this. Most North Dakotans don't know this story. But the Pick-Sloan Plan, shown here, after disastrous floods through the first half of the 20th century, a plan was developed called the Pick-Sloan Plan to tame the Missouri River once and for all. And one of the results was that there were going to be 6 main stem dams on the Missouri, so Fort Peck, Garrison, Oahe, Big Bend, Fort Randall, and Gavin's Point. They've all been built, overbuilt, frankly. But here's what's so interesting about this. They were deliberately sited to have the least possible impact on white communities and the least interest in protecting Native communities. I mean, just think of that. These Natives were not consulted whatsoever, but they were deliberately placed where the maximum flooding damage would be on Native lands and where the least flooding would be on non-Native lands. And so here's the dam. It was at the time the largest earth-filled rolled dam in the world. This is the reservation. You see the sort of the tan. And when they flooded it, the sort of lighter blue is the lake. And what it did, if you can imagine it, The Mandan at this time were a largely self-sufficient people. And they had 155,000 acres of prime agricultural land down in the river bottom, some of the best agricultural land on the Great Plains. That's precisely what was flooded out. And they were forced up onto the bluffs in these new places, including a place called Newtown. And the reservation became split, so they could no longer cross the river. They had to drive 150 miles to get to somebody who 3 weeks before was 4 miles away. It sort of fragmented the whole reservation. This is a wound that continues to this day. And in the new Mandan Interpretive Center in Newtown, North Dakota, which is a world-class facility, they have a wall. They show the dam, and they have a picture of the river, and they have a wall that's just this tan, and on it are named every family that was flooded out forever. It's just like the Vietnam Memorial Wall. No commentary, just that's the impact. I could go much farther into this. Here's the lake. Just a couple more things about it. First, no consultation with natives. Citing for maximum damage to natives. Virtually no compensation package. A man named Lewis Pick, who was the engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, came out to do an explanation meeting in one of these towns, and there was an incident where a native sort of flipped him off or gestured in some defiant way. He flew into a rage and he went back to Washington and stripped all of the compensation out of the bill to punish them for protesting for their own life. They asked to be able to cut timber. This flooded out hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of cottonwood trees. They asked to be able to cut those trees, to use them. They were denied. They asked to be able to graze animals in drought years on lands approaching the reservoir. They were denied. They offered to trade lands in another place. They were denied. And then guess what? Williston, North Dakota, which is up where that says Trenton service area, a white community, and one of the richest places in the world now. It's an oil patch. They discovered that the dam on a heavy water year like this one might bring some floodwaters into the 2 or 3 streets on the eastern edge of Williston, and the Corps of Engineers dropped the dam by 10 feet to accommodate Williston. But they had no interest in accommodating the native people. And this is the signing ceremony for the compensation package that actually once finally occurred. And this is the tribal development officer, George Gillette. He was there and he burst into tears because he said, this is a bad day for us. This effectively destroyed. This was a Holocaust in the Mandan world. This photograph, printed at this size, is the first thing you see when you go into the tribal headquarters of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. A kind of a never forget photograph. And here's another one of the same day. I mean, this story is so haunting. This couldn't happen today. Today, the natives would be at the table. Today, the Environmental Protection Act, we have many, many more ways to protect indigenous rights today. Not perfectly, but this could not have happened in 2023. It happened in 1946. And I know many, many Mandan people. They're wonderful people, and they don't talk about it. But if it comes up somehow, you can see it's a gaping wound to this day. And they have never really fully recovered because they were agriculturalists and their agricultural world was flooded out forever. Now they're ranchers, but that's not quite the same thing. All right, this is just one example of this, of course. That's one I happen to be intimately familiar with. And here's the thing, if you read the textbooks in North Dakota for 8th grade or sophomore, this story comes up in the mildest sort of way, that this had a little impact on the native people and too bad. And I ask almost every white person I meet in North Dakota, do you know the story of the impact of Garrison Dam? And they don't. And why don't they? Because they choose not to. They choose not to face that because it's not pleasant to face such things. But we have to face them. We don't have to be righteous about it, but we do have to embrace our past, warts and all. All right, I'm moving on. Land, sovereignty, and reservation. So, in the beginning, that was Native America. When Columbus bumbled in and found Los Indios. And then after the first colonies in 1790, that was Indian America. And then at the age of Andrew Jackson, that was Indian America. And by the time the Indian Wars were over, this was permanent Indian territory, Oklahoma. That was Indian America. And this was meant to be permanent Indian territory, but it wasn't. And so here's Oklahoma today. Doesn't look quite the same, does it? So at one time, 100% of America was native. Today, 6%, 5.8%. And they had to work so hard to hold on to that much. Here's another one. You see, Red Cloud is said to have said, "The white men make many promises. We have heard them all. They never keep any of them. Oh, they kept one. They promised to take our land, and they did it." It's worse than that. Let's look at South Dakota for a moment. Lots of Indian country. Look at all these reservations. This is Lakota. 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 This is a Sisseton. It's sort of the Minnesota Sioux. So when you look at the map, you think, well, that's a fair amount of country, isn't it? So let's just look at one of these reservations. This one, the Cheyenne River Reservation. There it is. But here's what happened. In 1887, a Massachusetts senator, Henry Dawes, who was actually a philanthropist and very much wanted to help and protect natives, decided that the best thing that could be done is to get them to cease their tribal ways and become homesteaders like their white counterparts. And so he helped to get the Dawes Act passed, and the Dawes Act said that every native family could claim their 160 acres, or if you were a single woman, 80 acres, and that would be your homestead. You'd get a deed to it. And there was an enrollment period of X years to do that. But once that enrollment period expired, surplus lands would be available to white settlement. And so look at this. All those white patches on this reservation are owned by white people. Now, some of the land is tribal trust land, and then the tribal individual holdings are in the dark gray. But think of this. So when you look at this map, you think, wow, that's a substantial reservation. On most reservations in this country, no less than 35% and as much as 65% of the land is actually owned by white people. And yet when you see it on the map, you think Indian country. But the Dawes Act, which was meant to be a philanthropic act, boomeranged and opened well over half of all the remaining Indian lands in the country, 92 million acres, to white settlement. Most of you don't know that. I didn't know that. We need to know that. Natives are trying to buy land restoration. They're putting together funds, and when one of these properties comes up for sale, they buy it. They're trying to re-knit the reservation together. And if you can imagine it, in several western states, legislatures are trying to forbid that, not wanting the natives to be able to reassert their sovereignty. And this is the sort of thing that happened during that period. Here they're using Red Cloud to suggest that white people can come in and buy these lands. Indian land for sale. Guess who's selling it? The U.S. government. All right. That's all grim, and I apologize, but it's important that we understand this. It's important that we realize that these things happened, that there has been a systematic dispossession of native peoples in the course of American history, and we all understand that. It might have been inevitable, but we all understand it. But most natives will say the Indian wars aren't over. They're just not any longer fought with rifles and bows and arrows and so on. Well, let's just look at some possibilities here. Number one, this is Canada. You've heard of it. They, for the past 20 years, have been engaged in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And if you know anything about South Africa, after the black majority retook South Africa. Nelson Mandela and others instituted Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which were meant to provide closure and healing. And they work different ways in different places. The ones in Canada are mostly about the Indian boarding schools, and you've all heard about those. And so what happens in this, and I don't want to get too graphic with it, but what happens in Canada, not yet in the United States, is that they will bring in people who were basically stripped from their families and their homes to go off to Indian boarding schools against their better judgment. They will bring them back, and they then face the people, the school teachers, the superintendents, the principals, etc., that were oppressing them during this period, and they get to say to them whatever they want to say. You know, they shout, scream, cry, beat your hand on the table, and the white person has to take it without comment. And then often, it's really an amazing process, and I know Dale and Jeannie know a lot about this from South Africa. Often there is a kind of healing. People wind up hugging, and just for being apologized to, just for having your voice heard, just for being able to get out the rage and the trauma, it has not always, but often a healing effect. And Canada has done this in a big systematic way. If you go to the Human Rights Center National Museum in Winnipeg, there are about 20 volumes of this. And our own Deb Holland, look at that pride. She wants to institute this here. Going to be a lot harder here, as you know. But she's trying to do some little parts of it around the edges with such discretionary funds as she has in her budget, because she understands that this does work. All right. Other good news. You must get to Denver to see this exhibit. This is the one I've been talking about that's in the History Center. Written by Cheyenne and Arapaho. Every panel has the word "we" in it in the first paragraph, and "we" means not me, it means the indigenous people. It's beautifully written, it's passionate, of course. This was a massacre that didn't need to happen. I don't know how much you know about this, but the Cheyenne, led by a man named Black Kettle, had been assured that if they would go out here, this is where it was, if they would go out to this place, look how far, it's 175 miles from Denver. I was there. It's about as far onto the desolate Great Plains as you can get. When you're out there, you think, if my car broke down here, I'm toast. No one lives out there. I love it, of course, because it's just there are pronghorn antelope and grass for hundreds of miles in every direction, and the biggest towns are like 300 people. It's way out there, and I urge you to go on a pilgrimage there. Take food and extra gas. But they were told if they would go out there and hold up a white flag and an American flag prominently, that they would never, ever, ever be molested. Which they did. And then Governor Evans turned loose John Shivington to go wipe them out in spite of that promise. And so when this happened, when Shivington and his militia came riding in at dawn, Black Kettle and other leaders came out and they were like, wait a minute, here's the flag. They were butchered, not only murdered, 230 individuals, mostly women and children, not only killed, but butchered. I hate to even talk about this, but the soldiers went on a rampage and they cut off women's breasts and vaginas and men's penises, and they brought these trophies back to Denver, and they hung them up in the theater, for which they received standing ovations. That's not us, but we are complicit in a somewhat indirect way in what has happened. And now this exhibit is one of the first great exhibits in this country to be told entirely from an indigenous point of view, not just having indigenous voices, but having indigenous people write, direct, design the exhibit. You must see it. Here's just a couple of panels. Weapons of mass destruction. These were the balls, they're like the size of a croquet ball, shot from a howitzer, and they're filled with ball bearings and other things so that when they hit, They do enormous personnel damage. It is true that the Cheyenne and the Arapaho tried to make peace again and again and again. This is the village of Eads, which has this signage here. And here is the place. It's a haunting place, and you see that when you go, you're asked to be quiet and reverent because it's a place of sacred tragedy for the Cheyenne. So I know that for some of us, we think, do we really want to stir all this up, and isn't this bending over the other direction, and is this really fundamentally fair, and so on. I know this because I know people that find this, everyone finds it troubling. I'm sure all of you are now. Many people find it, white people find it threatening in a certain kind of way, and so they react. Instead of saying, all right, let's just see what this is, they react, and we all are capable of doing that. I know I am. But I really strongly urge us not to get stuck on the politics of it, but to embrace the complexity of our history. I mean, we have an incredibly complex story. When Columbus got here, it was indigenous America. Now, 93% of all the property is owned by non-natives. And my friend Joe Ellis, who's a prominent historian, says maybe that was inevitable, like Greek tragedy. But I don't really think that's an adequate answer. Anyway, I don't want to belabor this. And we certainly don't have room to be righteous, but I do think we have room to be sober, and that we must force ourselves to embrace and ingest these hard truths. Or I don't think we can go on. I think, as with the reconciliation commissions, when Native people hear us say, we get it, and your governor had a recent governor, held a meeting on the Capitol steps, and he formally apologized to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. And if you want to see it, it's a very, very moving clip. Just look for it on the internet. All right, land acknowledgement statements. I should say we are meeting tonight on Ute and Arapaho land, and these land acknowledgement statements are being adopted all over the country by institutions of every sort. And to just give you a couple. So here's one, the Watermark Arts Center. Here's another one, Indiana University Bloomington sits on ancestral homelands of the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee. Here's a longer one about the University of New Mexico. Here's a harder one, the Chicago Blackhawks doing an acknowledgement statement. I think most natives would say, how about start with the name change? And then we'll have time for the acknowledgement statement. So I have mixed feelings about this. I'm working on this for Jenkinson State University in western North Dakota. We're going to adopt an acknowledgement statement. But when I talk to my friends in the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara world, they say, good, you're going to give the land back too? You know, it's one thing to say, you know, oh, we're on Ute land. Does that absolve us from further engagement with this? And so I'm pushing for Jenkinson State, and I'm certainly not alone, and I'm not pretending to be a leader in this, but I'm pushing for us to do more than that, to figure out new scholarships, to maybe have a branch campus, to fund Native American studies, you know, what other things. There has to be more than just saying, here I am on Mandan land, too bad. But this is something that people are wrestling with. And some people reject this. I don't reject it, but I think a simple statement is better than nothing. It's the start, but I think it needs to be more than that. Just a couple quick things here. Books to read. And if you give me your address, I'll send this to you. But here are some, just like you, there are magnificent books to read. Choose your poison. Black Elk Speaks, I already showed you. God is Red, Vine Deloria Jr., regarded by many as the Bible of modern Native American resistance. Fool's Crow by James Welch. He was a Blackfoot, a Piegan. It's one of my favorite works of literature from any culture. It's about the meeting of the pioneer culture and the native people and all the things that happen when that occurs. Some good. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, most of you know, it was a famous book in the 1970s. Reservation Blues by Sherman Alexie. He's been canceled somewhat by the Me Too movement, and maybe rightly so, but his books are so great that I really urge you to take a look. Tom Powers' The Killing of Crazy Horse, about the last years of the Lakota resistance. Philip Deloria is Vine Deloria's son. He teaches at Harvard. We're trying to get him to come here. I hope we do. He certainly agreed to sit for an interview. And he has several books. One is called Indians in Unexpected Places, and the other one is called Playing Indian, about pageants and so on. Excellent, first-rate scholarship. My own state's Louise Erdrich is North Dakota's greatest writer, by far. And she has many, many books that you can read. The Night Watchman is a really good one. And then finally, Ralph K. Andrus, The Long Death. And if you don't have those, then just talk to me. I'll be sure to get that into your hands. But these are books. This isn't tedious reading. These are extraordinarily well-written, fair, thoughtful, non-judgmental, except for Vine Deloria Jr., books, which I just love. All right, I just want to tell you just briefly, before I turn to some questions, about this project I'm doing called the Edward Curtis Project. And we're going to be talking about it in August. So I hope you'll come to that. So Curtis was a studio photographer in Seattle. He began to take landscape photos outside of the studio and also pictures of native people in the Puget Sound area. He went out with George Bird Grinnell to the Blackfoot world to photograph around their Sundance. He didn't get to photograph it precisely, but he photographed around it. And he had a kind of Pauline conversion experience and decided, this is my work. I'm going to photograph Indians all over the American West before it's too late. And he did so. He was using dry glass plate photography, which is exceedingly difficult. It's not as difficult as wet plate photography, but it's very complex. These plates are heavy, they crack. It's amazing. He took 40, well, we don't quite know, but he said he took 40,000 glass plates of Native Americans. And then he produced a 20-volume classic printed on the highest quality paper with the greatest copper plate engravings called The North American Indian, and it's regarded as one of the supreme works of American culture. If you want to buy a complete set, I know some of you have that wealth, it's just 3.5 million now. So, but you could give me my 200,000. But anyway, so I'm doing this, and so my job is elders. I'm going around to 7 regions that he photographed, and seeking out native spokespeople, native elders, not always old, but people with great cultural wisdom. And then I show them individual plates by Curtis, and they comment on them and point out things that I could never, ever, ever see. And they comment more generally on Curtis. It's marvelous. It is so powerful. And this allows native peoples to interpret their own culture through Edward S. Curtis's achievement. And there's no white art historian who could do it. I certainly couldn't as a mere humanities scholar. And these natives sometimes are a little shy at first and even resisting this. But once they get on board with this and start talking, it's just a certain magic happens. I'm going to try to have time just to show you one little piece of this. So this is Jack Gladstone. This is how it works. So we have the camera set up and the sun filter. He's Blackfeet, he's Piegan, and he's also a singer and a comedian. And so this is at Flathead Lake not so long ago. Here's Curtis on the left and right. That's Whale on the right. Good-looking fellow. 40,000 dry glass plates, maybe, certainly tens of thousands. He took the little cylinder recorders of the time with the cylinder discs, between 8,000 and 10,000 cylinder recordings. They're in Indiana University. Amazing. He made a docudrama called The Land of the Headhunters. Economic failure, but still extraordinary and important. And then the 20-volume North American Indian. And he had a picture opera. He went around to Carnegie Hall and the Denver Opera House and showed lantern slides, and then had music composed by a distinguished American composer And then he had tableaus of lodges and so on. And this was a way to try to raise money for the project. And here are Colleen and John Graybill of Buena Vista. You've heard of Buena Vista? Some people mistakenly say Buena. But once you're naturalized here, it's Buena. And they're right here, so just raise your hands. And they are doing a similar project, maybe more important, they're doing the Descendants Project. So they're finding images of native people and then seeking out their descendants and photographing them and presenting them not only with that, but with a great engraving print of the original. And I won't try to speak for them, but you can talk with them afterwards. It's amazing what they're doing. And these are people then who are saying, sometimes I didn't even know this, or our culture is enriched now because we have this linkage. So these are, and I want to say this, and I'm going to say this carefully. They're white people, I'm a white person. In the ideal world, this would be done by natives. And it is to a certain degree. But just because we're white doesn't mean we don't have heart, generosity, respect, desire to get it right, and humility in the face of this. And so, I can't pretend that I'm anything other than a Germanic North Dakotan. I said "ufta" earlier, and everyone said, huh? That's how North Dakotans talk. But I'm fascinated by this, and I don't feel that I need to apologize unnecessarily for this fascination as long as my heart is good and my respect is deep. Some people disagree, and I accept that too. But this one of his most famous of all photographs in Canyon de Chelly. I was there earlier for Listening to America, and there are brochures in the back if you want to sign up for my newsletter. You can't take this picture anymore because there are foliage, cottonwoods and tamarisks and so on, but this is one of his most iconic photographs. And just keep in mind on this, I can't go into this, but I will in August. He does not take snapshots. He couldn't take a snapshot. If you ever see those pictures, like at a Paul McCartney concert, and everyone's hand is up with a smartphone, taking pictures or video, every photograph he ever took had to be composed. It takes seconds for the emulsion to be exposed. You have to know what you want. You have to set this up long in advance. You wait for the perfect light. He probably had like a Hollywood cone and said, move forward or move back or more space. I would take 33,000 photographs before I got the one I wanted. He got one or two. And so to get a photograph of this stunning magnificence not only shows his perseverance and his drive and his commitment. He gave 30 years to this. And guess what? When he died, he was essentially penniless. He never made money on this, never wanted to make money on this. And when he died, the New York Times had a 72-word obituary which barely mentioned this project. One of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of anthropology. And it's not just photographs. The 20 volumes have deep and rich ethnography, which he took down. Just a few more. He got such money as he had from J.P. Morgan, the financier, on the right. He did not take that picture. So far as we know, he didn't take a picture of J.P. And this is a young Mojave woman, Mosa, and when he went to see Morgan trying to get money for him, and Morgan said, no, I'm not interested, I don't fund stuff like this, go away. And Curtis said, I'm not going away till you look at my portfolio. And Morgan wasn't used to being talked to that way, but he did. He was paging through, okay. He came to this, he said, wow, if you can take pictures like this, I'll fund you. And he funded him $15,000 a year for 5 years, and eventually much more. But it was that breakthrough, brought about, by the way, by Theodore Roosevelt in part. Two famous Curtis photographs. On the left, the most iconic photograph of Chief Joseph of the Nimipu. And on the right, Red Cloud, just a short time before his death. The great Ogallala leader, Red Cloud. Look at that photograph. Look at both of them. If you gave me $1 million, and please do, but if you gave me $1 million and said, I want you to spend the rest of your life taking portraits of native people, I could never do this. This is not a photograph. This is the work of an artist who somehow connected in a way that can only be regarded as beyond normal with these people and drew out of them or saw into them their deep dignity, humanity, sorrow, etc. Other people take pictures of Native Americans. There are stunning ones in every direction, but there's nothing anywhere like these. This is the Hopi world. When you're a virgin, when you're a maiden, you wear this sort of peach blossom hair, and then when you get married, not anymore. And he loved the Hopi world almost more than any other native world. Went back 6 times at least. Some landscapes, some with not with people in them. This is my single favorite Curtis photograph. It was taken in North Dakota. It's of a Hidatsa eagle catcher. This is in the Killdeer Mountains in North Dakota. By mountain in North Dakota we mean small hill. And look at this photograph. So I asked Gerard Baker of the Hidatsa, an elder, to interpret this. And he noticed, he said, well, that eagle is hanging in a certain direction because he earned it in such and such a way. He said his hose are trade cloths, so that was not done in a traditional way. He said he would not be allowed to have this eagle unless he was a bona fide eagle catcher who had prayed and fasted and so on and so forth. But then he also, in his lantern slides for his picture operas around the country, colorized some of them. And there's a colorized version of the same. Some people like these better. I don't. They seem a little garish to us, but this would have seemed like super technicolor in 1915. This is Gerard Baker, the Hidatsa elder that I began with on the Elders Project. All right, I'm not going to talk much about this, but I'm going to try to do just 2 things, and then we're going to take questions. There's a place in North Dakota called Fort Dilts. There was an incident there in September of 1864, so just a couple of months before what happened at Sand Creek. It's a kind of a not very well known or very well interpreted site in southwestern North Dakota, and I'm writing a new interpretation of it and trying to get it right. Not to take the Native point of view, but not to take any point of view, just to make sure all the stakeholders are accurately and I hope sensitively portrayed. And so it's swollen to 30,000 words, so I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it's been enormously interesting. I just wanted to show you 2 quick slides. This is not at Fort Dilts. This is on the Blackfoot Reservation near Browning, Montana. And this, excuse me for the sort of like band leader photograph here, but this is a monument to Lewis and Clark. This is the northernmost point that they got in Montana, and it was called Camp Disappointment. And the Great Northern Railroad put this up in the 1930s without consulting the people on whose reservation it is. And so the Pecuni, the Blackfeet, have taken it back by shooting bullets into it and using spray paint. And it says Piegan Blackfeet land. Some people object to this. I think it's sort of okay. It was put up without consulting them. Their view is, hey, you can wipe this paint off if you really want to. We're making our view known. But here's an even better one, and I'll close with this and we'll try the video. This is where Sitting Bull's cabin is on the Grand River on the North Dakota-South Dakota border. You have to really, really want to go there with a good 4-wheel drive. I've been there 5 or 6 times. And the South Dakota State Historical Society put up this sign, and I'll read a bit to you in a minute. But look at the stuff that's kind of gray. The Lakota, who revere Sitting Bull, have come in and edited this text. These are like raised bas-relief letters. And here's what it says. At the bottom it says, erected by the South Dakota State Historical Society. They crossed out historical because it's not our history. We weren't consulted when the sign was put up. Here's another one. In the original it says, Sitting Bull, best known American Indian leader of the hostile. They crossed that out. Groups for a generation, a powerful orator, a clever prophet. Lakota didn't like that term because it seemed a little condescending, so they erased that. Hostile they erased. And at the bottom it says that it was the tragic end of a notable, if misguided, Indian leader. So white people wrote that, of course, and I think they all actually thought they were being quite generous. This is the 1950s. And so the Lakota have gone in and said, okay, here's my file. I'm going to amend this. I think this is genius, really. Because if South Dakota doesn't like it, they can put up a different sign. I think this is genius, because when you see it, you have to reflect. How does that sound? If you were Lakota, how would you feel about this? Who gets to write this? Who owns the history of the death of Sitting Bull? Yes, it's vandalism, as this is vandalism, but it's not a shooting match in the OK Corral. I just think this is extraordinarily interesting, whatever you think about it. And I love the idea that probably a small number of Lakota people came and said, you know what, we're going to fix this. And they did, in a way, because you see, you can see through it, so you still get to see what's being erased. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Whatever else is true, it makes you think about this sort of thing. And so, anyway, here's this Fort Dilson I'm working on. Talk about middle of nowhere. And this is their sign, which is a better sign. And this is Fanny Kelly, who was captured and taken there. Sitting Bull was injured there, and so on and so forth. So now, James, if you can cue this up. Just going to close with this and take your questions. But this is this video of an Absaroka, a Crow elder, named Aaron Breen. Getting it? Aaron Breen is a cultural spokesman for the Crow, the Absaroka, and in this Elders Project last summer, I went out there. And by the way, the Graybills went out there too at another time and got extraordinary footage. And in this little clip, this is just one of a 4-hour interview. This little, maybe 2 minutes we'll watch. He's reflecting on Curtis, because as you know, some people think Curtis was engaged in cultural appropriation. Some people think he had no right doing this. Some people think he romanticized the natives or locked them into a past that was gone, or that he manipulated his subjects, or in some cases bribed his subjects and so on, intruded on the sacred. All these charges are made against him. I think they can all be answered with good faith. But there are issues, and we need to face those head on. And so I'm asking him, he looked at many, many individual portraits, but then he's talking about Curtis's persistence. So let's just watch about 2 minutes.
My opinions on Curtis is like, he was more of an obsessed kind of person. So I'm not quick to like sanctify him and like this noble work he did in capturing an era. And so intent has a lot to do with my opinion on him. And I don't know if his intent was as noble as it's come out to be. I also think that people just get tunnel vision, and then their pride gets in the way, and people are saying, hey, stop, you got to stop doing this. This project's draining you. But his mindset is like, no, now to prove you wrong, I'm going to do this. I mean, he lost like everything over it, you know? I just appreciate his photos. His recordings are, to me, the best thing he did.
The audio?
Yeah.
And you listened to some of that?
I've listened to all of them.
And what do you make of it?
That's bizarre, man. It's like, it's so wild. That I do like. I mean, that to me is like the most precious thing he did was press record when nobody else was. So it's pretty impressive. I've gone to Bloomington, Indiana and listened to them. Yeah.
And there are quite a few.
There's 5,000 total recordings, but I think there's maybe about 400 Crow recordings.
He obviously liked it here because he spent a lot of time here.
Yeah, he did. And in terms of accuracy, he's not bad. Like Volume 4 isn't as bad as some of these other guys. But that's because he's untrained.
Go ahead.
I think the reason he's good at his work is because he's untrained. He's not polluted by theory or anything. He just kind of does what's of interest. Because I think he's off his rocker a little bit, you know. I mean, would you do it? You know what I mean? Would you do what he did? Nobody would. No anthropologist, no professionally trained anthropologist has ever come close to the amount of work he's done in documenting anything. 22 volumes on tribal people. How many photos? How many recordings? It's crazy. That's crazy. It's hard for me sometimes to articulate my opinion on him because, I mean, I feel like I'm obsessed with things, but I'm not 22 volumes obsessed with anything. I mean, just think of the work at the time. Even now with our conveniences now, would you do it now? No, nobody would. Nobody would do it now. With all the stuff we have to do it, you wouldn't do it. We'll never come across it again. And it didn't happen before. It's bigger than the Bible.
You see he's wearing a seed cap and a shirt, and so part of your mind says, well, why isn't he dressed like an Indian? You think of how that is. He's a guy who lives in Harding, Montana, goes to the co-op. He shops in the grocery store. You know, he's just a Montanan, but he's also a Crow, an Absaroka. And he took us out to a sacred site where there's a white clay that was used to paint horses during battles and so on. But he doesn't want to try to conform to a white person's impression of what a native person should be or look like. And that's good. It's jarring, but it jars you out of any complacency or any sort of romantic mythology of the thing. I remember my friend Amy Mossett from North Dakota is a Mandan, Lakota, and she played a big role in the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and she had a gorgeous buckskin dress and moccasins and beadwork and so on, braided hair. And then she would do that once in a while at a festival. But when she got calls from all over the country to come present, they would talk to her and set a fee and get the flight arranged, and then they'd say, and be sure to bring your costume. Well, it's not a costume, and it's not something white people get to buy for their public presentation. So she might appear in sweats. She might appear in a business suit. She might appear in jeans and a Western cowboy shirt. The point is, we don't get to decide, and we tend, whether we like it or not, this is the sort of the strength of Philip Deloria's work, we non-natives tend to lock natives into a past and insist sort of that if they were real natives, they would conform to our fantasy image of who they are or should have been. And so this kind of thing jars you out of that in a really, really, really important way. So, just to start on this subject, well, let's take a few questions before you go. Yes, here.
Before we dive into questions, I'll bring you the microphone. Please speak into the microphone, stand if you're able, and I'd like to recognize Dave here, who's from the TP Raisers organization. Dave, would you just mind standing up, and folks can turn around. He's helping put on these events this weekend with flight days and working with the Land Trust. Are you willing to stick around for a few minutes and chat with folks if they have questions about the events? Okay, thank you.
There's a question right over here.
Okay, yeah, let's start right here.
Names like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, were those names that the natives called themselves, or was this something that white people named them as?
Excellent question, and complex. So first of all, when I have a child, I name her Catherine, and it goes on a birth certificate, and she's Catherine or Kathy or Kate or Kit for the rest of her life, but formally Catherine. This isn't universally true, and you must never generalize about all native peoples, but say on the Plains tribes, you would get a name shortly after birth, and then a few years later, if something happened, if you leaped across the creek, or if you did something brave on a horse, or if you survived a fall or something, you might get a name that is then given to you by a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, and then that name becomes. So Crazy Horse doesn't mean crazy horse. It's just a white approximation to a term that means something like, when he's on his horse, it's amazing dynamism. And so that becomes Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull does mean sitting bull, but it doesn't mean, one white. There's a great book on this by Evan S. Connell called Son of the Morning Star, and he riffs on this. Because white people, if you can imagine it, during the 19th century, wouldn't call Sitting Bull Sitting Bull. They called him semi-recumbent cow, semi-recumbent buffalo cow, Sitting Bull. So there's all this caricature and stereotype and sarcasm and so on. So when we think of a name like Red Cloud, it means, in this case, it means something like when he was born, either Venus or Mercury was prominent in the sky, or a meteor was in the sky, and so then it becomes Red Cloud. But that's not a name that a person would hold through life necessarily. And so white people have a really hard time pronouncing. I mean, just think of Sacagawea, Sacagawea, Sakakawea, Sakagawea, Sakakawea. William Clark called her Janie because he just couldn't do it. And so white people can't get their palates around many of these ways of signing, of speaking, And so they then impose a name and then stick with it, even if it no longer is valid. And so it's very complex, and it often seems caricature. So John Wesley Powell, one of my heroes, wanted natives to change their names to something that wasn't eagle feather or something because he thought that would always lead to ridicule. Well, he was wrong. And now increasingly we're moving back to the actual indigenous name, not Red Cloud or not Sitting Bull or not Rain in the Face and so on. So it's very complex is all I can say. And white people have gotten it wrong for centuries, and we're just beginning now to try to be more respectful and sensitive. Other questions or comments? Yes, here's one.
On the reservations themselves, do the Native Americans have mineral rights if shale oil or, let's say, silver, lead, anything is found on that?
And what about mineral rights? It varies from reservation to reservation, of course. A lot of the mineral rights were alienated to railroads and others during this period, but generally speaking, the natives have the rights to the minerals under their lands. And keep in mind that a reservation is many, many different things. But one of the things it also is a sovereign nation state. So when you cross into the Navajo reservation, you are leaving the United States to a certain degree and entering into the Navajo world, where their jurisdictions hold, where their speed limits hold, where their licensing systems hold, where their systems of policing and crime and punishment hold. And so these cause enormous jurisdictional tensions and conflicts. And so natives do tend to own the minerals under their land. So in my own case in North Dakota, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara own the minerals under their reservation, a tiny fragment of what it once was, but it's the sweet spot of the Bakken oil. And so they are rich beyond comprehension now. They have more money than literally they know what to do with, and they're investing it in education, in healthcare, in nutritional programs, in addiction recovery programs, and so on. And so they're using the money to try to give themselves a permanent leg up and overcome some really systemic problems. People often are concerned about gambling and gambling resorts on reservations, and they can go both ways. Some of them don't work out very well. But on the whole, if you study this, the casinos have lifted the reservation economy and lifted the lives of native people living on them, with exceptions, of course. And so good things are happening in Indian country, and I won't go into a lot of it, but language restoration. And with AI, this is going to be a revolution. I'll give you one quick example. The Mandan were once a people of 20,000 or more living around what's now Bismarck and Mandan, North Dakota. They were reduced by one smallpox epidemic in 1781 to about 1,200, so 20,000 to 1,200. In 1837, another smallpox epidemic came, and they were reduced from 1,200 to about 40 or 100. Down that tiny little remnant from which they've rebuilt their genetic pool to a certain degree. The Mandan language has now snuffed out. The last fluent Mandan speaker died a few years ago, Edwin Benson. And when he died, most people would have said that's the end of the Mandan language forever. However, during the last 15 years of his life, thanks to federal, state, and BIA grants, he was mic'd up virtually all of the time. And he would tell stories, and he would sing songs, and he would talk to his friends, and he would do alphabets and so on. And so all of that is recorded and now digitized. And with artificial intelligence, if you can imagine it, we may be able to construct voice and language training programs from Edwin Benson. So if he says enough things, he covers the entire Mandan vocabulary, and we have his pronunciation and his cadence, and AI can fill in some of the gaps, and it is now quite possible that young Mandan, if they want to, or young white people too, could learn Mandan, something that would have been physically impossible 15 years ago, and is now possible thanks to artificial intelligence and extremely advanced digital computing. So this may be very good news, because when this happened, when Edwin Benson was dying, he and people around him said, when Edwin dies, that's the end of the Mandan people, because you are your language, and your language is you. There will always be genetic Mandan people, but they speak English or Spanish. But unless they know what a wolverine is in Mandan, or what a thunderstorm is in Mandan, or what a grass prairie is in Mandan, a sort of a deep structure of their own metaphysics dies. And so it's at least possible now that we will see revolutions in language restoration, not just for indigenous Americans, but for indigenous peoples all around the world. So it's fascinating.
I wonder if you could comment on what I perceive to be an imbalance in our society right now. It seems that there's a trend of our society looking at injustices that have gone on in the past. And we see many states and jurisdictions looking at reparations to African Americans for slavery. And some of the things that you've pointed out that have occurred with the indigenous Indian populations are so serious as well. And yet there does not seem to be the same appreciation or even the same acknowledgement of the need to address these past injustices.
Another great question. Yes and no. So I'll give you one example. The Black Hills were taken from the Lakota and the Cheyenne illegally after gold was discovered in the 1870s. George Custer went down in 1874, discovered gold, and you know what happens in a gold rush. And so the Black Hills were just stripped from the Lakota and Cheyenne people without, there were attempts at negotiations, but they broke down because Sitting Bull and others said, no, there isn't a cupful of the Black Hills we're willing to sell. So the white people just took it. Well, the 1868 treaty said that was Lakota and Cheyenne land forever, and it would never be abrogated unless there were 3/4 signatures by the adult males of the tribe to do it. That's never happened. And so in the 1970s, the Lakota sued in the federal courts and won. And the courts weren't going to give back the land, but they offered them, I think at that time, $17 million in compensation. The Lakota said, no. Money flows through your hands like water in a sieve. We don't want any money. We're never going to take the money. The judge said, very well, we'll just put it in an account, and maybe you'll change your mind. So now it's up to like $20 billion. And the Lakota say, no, never. Don't you understand? We want the land. This is going on, and tiny little bits are being restored around the edges. But if you go to the Black Hills, 70% of the Black Hills are public land. National Park, National Forest, Bureau of Indian Reservation, Bureau of Land Management, National Monument, state parks, state school lands. So in other words, you could give back a very large percentage of that land without chasing any non-native off of that land. You could work around the inholdings, and you could do substantial justice in this way. It hasn't happened yet. It surely is going to happen in some part. Reparations are a very problematic thing, as you all know. I think that the smartest people doing this are talking about targeted reparations, language restoration, grants for young people to get higher ed and degrees, Indian health, things that can really make a difference, that this is better than just handing out checks. And so this is happening around the country, and it's going to heat up. You probably remember that Pope Francis was in Canada a year and a half ago, and he apologized for the boarding schools. And it was an amazing thing, because there were all these Canadian first Americans that were there, first Canadians, and they thanked him, of course, for apologizing. And then one of them said, and how about repudiate the doctrine of discovery? And the Pope said, well, we're not quite ready for that. But this year he did it. He repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which was how the papal states and the international courts divvied up the world into Portuguese, Spanish, American, English, French places. So now that he's repudiated the doctrine of discovery, that doesn't mean that everything dissolves and goes back to the way it was, but it means that there will be legal tests based on that now to see what that means by practical implication, and I think it's going to make a difference. So beware. If I'm too old to see much of this, but if you're 7 years old and you're going to live till 2150, you're going to see a revolution in this country. And you know where it should begin is in the Great Plains, because they're empty. If you go east of Colorado Springs, Denver, and Fort Collins, there's a 250-mile stretch of absolutely empty land. This could easily become a new homeland for the Cheyenne or whatever. And so as the plains empty out of white people, and believe me, they're emptying out, this would be a possibility of a carefully negotiated set of reparations. Other people, I just want to say, other people say, no, that was then, and this, we can't go back. We can invest in Indian education, we can invest in health, we can do this, but these land reparations are just not on the table. So the politics of this are going to be extremely dense and complex, and I'm all over the map myself on these things, and not that my opinion matters, but we talk about reparations to African Americans, former slaves and descendants of slaves, and that has, as you say, that's a little bit more potent in the national consciousness than this, but it's going to change, and water is probably going to drive a lot of it. Is there another last question? We're over.
We're at time, and
Okay.
I just wonder if you would take a moment and share a little bit about the Conversations on Controversial Issues program on August 16th.
So yeah, I want to do two quick things, and I apologize for going a little long. Number one, on August 16th, we're going to have somewhere in the community one of our controversial subjects events, and we'll have two guests. One is Robert Williams from Arizona State, who is a distinguished dean, Native American, of a Native American rights organization and so on. He'll be one of the two guests. And the other will be a friend of mine from North Dakota named Tim Purdon, who was the U.S. Attorney for North Dakota, and he shocked North Dakota, really, and the nation by making Native American legal issues his work for the time he was the U.S. Attorney. And he made a big difference. So we'll be talking about some of these same themes and what you do about them, and they will bring an expertise to them that I simply don't have. I'll just be moderating, so I hope you will plan to come to that. But if you would just go to John Graybill for just 1 minute, John, just say a little bit about your project. 1 minute, John. This is the great-grandson of Edward S. Curtis.
Thank you, Clay. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody. Wow, we've got a big audience here. Briefly, what we're doing, I founded the Curtis Legacy Foundation. You can find us on the internet. There's a great deal of information there. I seek out descendants of the people that my great-grandfather photographed, and then I photograph them. And I photograph them using the same kind of equipment and technology that my great-grandfather used. You know, so I'm doing dry plate, glass plate, whole plate size, which is 6.5 by 8.5 inch, which was his favorite size working in the field. And then I interview these people on video with audio, and we've got some museum exhibitions lined up to show some of this stuff. And we always show Curtis's photograph, my photograph, and then the story that ties that past to the present. And that's where the real power comes in. You know, a lot of the things that Clay talked about, we hear in our interviews with these Native people today. And it's been incredibly fascinating, an enormous journey of education and self-discovery for myself and for my wife, Colleen.
And just quickly, say the books you're publishing.
Is Denver on the schedule yet?
Denver is not.
But Buena Vista is.
Yeah. So along the way, as you can imagine, there's been some stuff passed down through the family. And we ended up with quite a collection of unpublished material from Great Gramps. And my wife, Colleen, here was totally bored during COVID. Says, I got to do something. I can't sit around locked in the house all this time. What are we going to do? And so we started going through a couple of notebooks that we had of Alaska pictures, and we soon realized none of these were in the North American Indian Volume 20. And so we did some research, and we realized we've got all this unpublished material. So we published our first book, Edward S. Curtis, Unpublished Alaska, It's for sale on our website. And the book is fascinating. For the first time, I believe, in this book, we incorporated Curtis's journal. And for those that aren't familiar with the story, his daughter Beth made him keep a journal. It's the first time in his 35 years of doing this project that he kept any kind of documentation about the events that took place. And so it's kind of a fascinating read.
And
So
there's another book coming.
Yes, and so we just sent the file to the printer for our next book. And again, it's Edward S. Curtis, Unpublished Planes. There's close to 200 photos in this one of all unpublished Edward Curtis photos. And through our work with our Descendants Project, we've met a lot of wonderful people, and we reached out to them and asked them to give us little intros in the various chapters, which they've done. So there's a lot of Native narrative in this book.
So John, thank you very much, and
Thank
we
you.
wish you well with this project.